and I'm really looking forward to this session as well. It is a issue that's very close to my heart. It's going to look at the collision of business and geopolitics, and indeed the rise of a new kind of stakeholder, the home country. So I'm very interested to hear more about it, and to introduce and moderate the session, I'd like to invite up onto the virtual stage a longtime friend of Provoke Media from Weber Shandwick, Geopolitical Strategy and Risk EVP, Michelle Guda. Michelle, welcome.
Wonderful to see you, Arun. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. I wish we could be doing this in person, of course, but we can't. So anyway, the virtual stage is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And really good to be here today. I'm joined by Matthew Swift and Jay Wang, and I'll introduce them in just a bit, but thought I would kick off the conversation with some slides. I believe I had some slides. Arun, tell me if we're wrong here, but there we go. Wanted to walk everyone through quickly just some key trends and key findings of a recent report that we just did, and then turn it over to a conversation here with Matt and with Jay about some of the trends that they are seeing in the landscape. So I'll start by saying home country stakeholders, Arun was just talking about. We did a report earlier this year, the genesis of which was this recognition that we are in a new geopolitical era, and one that we were certainly accelerated into by COVID. And we saw this push and pull for global businesses who, on the one hand, and amid a very global challenge, we're being called on to solve global problems with global solutions at the same time that a rise in national priorities and national agendas was really pulling them in different directions and causing them to balance national interests with a global remit as well. And so we wanted to get to the heart of, if a business is supposed to serve all stakeholders who matter, is home country a stakeholder too? And next slide, please. So what we did was talk to 1,200 multinational business executives across the world in 12 countries that you'll see here, all C-suite or reporting directly to the C-suite, all large multinational businesses. And when we say home country, we mean the country where a company is headquartered. And all of the respondents that we spoke with were based in the same country as their company was. So we spoke to American executives of American multinationals, Canadian executives of Canadian multinationals. Next slide, please. And so what did we find when it comes to this home country stakeholder? We found, on the next slide, 58% of executives across the world say that their home country is a critical stakeholder to their business. And not only are they saying that it's an important stakeholder, but it is on par, in fact, with customers and with shareholders. You'll see this list here of different stakeholders we provided, asked executives to rate them in terms of importance. And you'll see customers is first at 63%, followed by, tied for second, home country, in addition to shareholders. This is very compelling in the rise of the conversation around stakeholder capitalism. And as we started getting some of the results back, had started calling it the unspoken stakeholder. Executives here are saying it's very top of mind, but not something that you hear executives necessarily talking about to a great degree. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit, because of the risks that could present to their business. And on the next slide, you'll see this isn't just a phenomenon that was taking place in one country, but in nearly all of the markets that we surveyed. In 9 of the 12 markets that we surveyed, executives rated their home country as a top 3 stakeholder to their business. And in fact, in Canada and the US, you'll see executives there rated it as the first of very important stakeholders to their business. So certainly something we're seeing worldwide, and you hear it in the news, whether it's made in all of America, Brazil above everything, China standards 2035, European strategic autonomy, Brexit. All of these conversations are fracturing a global landscape as nations prioritize their interests in many ways. And on the next slide, you'll see, even in looking at the senior most decision makers within companies, so CEOs and corporate presidents alone, they rate their home country as the top stakeholder to their business. I think you'll just need to click one more and you'll see the list here come up. But home country is #1, even above customers. Again, feels like a very unspoken stakeholder, because you don't see a lot of senior leaders going out there talking about necessarily prioritizing the national interest, although that differs across the countries that we spoke to. And very anecdotally, we looked at the letters to shareholders of the top 10 companies in the Fortune Global 500, and only 4 of them, 2 of which were state-owned companies, but only 4 had any language in their letters to shareholders talking about national priorities and a national agenda and how the business was going to ladder up to that. And so even though executives aren't talking about it publicly yet, certainly something that they're saying is very top of mind. And if you go to the next slide, we then wanted to get to the heart of, okay, if home country is a critical stakeholder to businesses, how are executives factoring this into how they actually do business and how they make decisions? And on the next slide, you'll see home country, in fact, is a critical consideration to business leaders as they're doing business across the country. 62%, so nearly 3 out of 5, say that multinationals should make business decisions that consider their home country interest. And on the next slide, another really compelling finding here is this role of national security and the importance of national security. So important, in fact, executives are saying that it is more important to their decision-making than even diversity and inclusion, ESG, and climate change as they do business across the world. And you'll see this list here of 16 factors we provided to business executives, ask them to rate these in terms of importance. Cybersecurity, data privacy, corporate and brand reputation, you'll see are the top 3. And then there's 56% that are saying national security is a very important business decision-making factor. And not only is that interesting, it's more interesting in that it is 6 to 10 points higher than they rated D&I, ESG, human rights, and climate change. So these other topics and issues that are certainly very top of mind for businesses, you'll see at least 50% are saying that these are important. Very compelling that national security they're indicating is even more important than some of these factors. And then I'll wrap here by just going through a few of the geopolitical risks that we see, and then we'll start a discussion here with Matt and Jay. But on the next slide, we wanted to get to amid all of these factors, what are the new risks? What are the new opportunities that this presents to business as they are operating across the world? And on the next slide, you'll see executives are saying they feel very vulnerable to geopolitical risk. 47% feel more vulnerable today than they did 5 years ago. More than 40% say they expect to feel more vulnerable in the next 5 years. So their sense of geopolitical risk to their company and to their business is on the rise over the past 5 years and in the next 5. And on the next slide, you'll see, we asked, well, what are these geopolitical concerns? What issues are top of mind? And unsurprisingly, pandemics is at the top. We are still coming out of a global pandemic, but pandemics, cyber attacks, data privacy, these issues that we're seeing dominate headlines in many ways all across the world are top of mind geopolitical risks. But I'll call your attention to a couple here that stood out to us, which is first, disinformation. Nearly half of executives, 49%, say that disinformation about their company is a very top concern to their business as they're doing business across the world. And then also surprisingly on the right, you'll see relatively low on the geopolitical risk agenda are these other topics and issues that are predominating business and media conversations today: gender, ethnic, and racial discrimination, attacks on press freedom, income inequality, etc. So executives are saying those aren't as top of mind as some of these other issues. However, important for this discussion here is we looked at how communicators alone responded to this survey. So the respondents who are in charge of marketing and communications within their organizations, and they rate gender, ethnic, and racial discrimination, as well as attacks on press freedom, much higher relative to some of these other risks. So communications leaders are more sensitive to, more attuned to some of these issues in terms of their impact on their company and its reputation. And on the next slide, you'll see there's a very interesting employee component as well. In fact, 8 in 10 executives say that they believe geopolitical tensions are going to impact their employees and impact them negatively. 82% feel that increasing tensions between countries are going to negatively impact the commitment of employees outside of their home country, so foreign employees who are working for their company across the globe. And then the same for recruitment. Nearly 8 in 10 are also saying it's going to make it more difficult to recruit foreign talent to work for their company across the world. And so geopolitical tensions, geopolitical risk may be something that executives are saying internally inside of their walls before they even see it impacting their external operations and reputation. And then on the next slide, and very relevant for our conversation today, we also see most executives are feeling the pressure to prepare to speak out on geopolitical issues over the next 5 years. In fact, 87% are saying that they expect to have to do that very soon. We're certainly seeing this in many ways on a domestic level, or CEOs, organizations speaking out on political and social issues at home. They are now saying they're going to see that extending across borders, where they're going to have to speak out on geopolitical issues. Certainly that presents great risks to their business, as there are different interests, different priorities, different values across the countries where they have a global footprint and they are operating. And so the task at hand there is to really balance how they are coming out on some of those issues as they are forced to, and feel the pressure to speak out. And then finally, and I'll turn it over just after this, amid all of these new trends, amid the rise of the home country stakeholder, amid this increased vulnerability to geopolitical risk, amid this pressure to speak out on geopolitical issues, executives are saying that they are unprepared. 74%, so nearly 3 in 4, say their company is more reactive than proactive when it comes to geopolitical risk. And then 56% say that their senior leadership does not prepare well for geopolitical risk. And so in our conversation today, we'll talk about some of these trends and what executives can prepare for, what they can do proactively as all of these issues and geopolitical tensions increase the amount of risk to their business and their reputation. So it was a quick whirlwind through our home country as stakeholder report, but excited to share it today, and excited now to speak with Matthew Swift and Jay Wang. Matthew Swift is the co-founder and the CEO of Concordia, an organization which I'm very proud to be a senior advisor, but which for more than a decade has been dedicated to actively creating, elevating, sustaining cross-sector partnerships. So where public and private and civil society come together to solve social and global challenges. His leadership council is comprised of numerous heads of state, numerous CEOs of multinational companies, and so has a deep view into the intersection of public, private, and civil society. So thanks for being with us here today, Matthew.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. And also great to have Jay Wang, director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. I'm a UCLA Bruin, but that's okay. We are friends. Jay, yes. Jay leads the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. It's a partnership between the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism and the School of International Relations, where they are dedicated to the study and the practice of public diplomacy. And we'll talk about what that is in a moment, but they are regularly sought by foreign ministries, including the US State Department, as well as multilateral organizations, think tanks, institutions across the world. And I was very pleased to visit the Center on Public Diplomacy during my tenure as acting undersecretary in early 2020. So Matthew, Jay, thank you so much for being here. Let's turn it over to you, Matt, first. You are leading an organization that is at the center of where public and private meet and where they come together to solve global challenges. Our research is showing that public and private are meeting, and maybe in new ways, as national priorities start to fracture and shape the global agenda for companies that are operating across the globe. How are you seeing this rise of national priorities play out as business leaders try to solve global scale challenges?
I think we see it, and first off, thank you, Michelle and Jay. It's good to be with you this morning, and great to be at this conference. I think that what we have seen, especially following the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, one might have immediately predicted that organizations like Concordia, that our principal responsibility of bringing people together in person, would have seen some incredible difficulties in getting organizations, corporations, governments, civil society to sign up for digital type convenings during the pandemic. But in fact, we saw an increase or a growth in participation coming from those different institutions, and especially from the private sector, because I think that it all of a sudden shook the core foundations of so much of how we do business. It disrupted this ability to hop on a plane and travel around the world for a 2-day conference and then fly back and be back in time for dinner with your family. And so to lose that interconnectedness, that connectivity in general, I think was a significant wake-up call of how do we go about business? How do we go about solving global challenges? if we're not able to be together in person. So I think in part, COVID played an enormous role in this. But I also think, to your point and to the presentation that you gave, Michelle, whose findings very much match what we see from Concordia's broader global community, over 130 corporations that participate. And in our last summit, 19 heads of government participate. I think what we saw is a very, very similar trend, that these geopolitical movements have such a more significant impact on business, on commerce, than we've seen in some time. I think two big things that really stand out for me is that consumers are getting more and more informed, more and more educated on geopolitical dynamics, and it is having an impact on consumer activity. And I think corporations are starting to see that. We saw that 10 years ago when it came to ethical supply chain work, who's manufacturing your product. And now what we're starting to see is who is the government that runs the country where your product is manufactured, and what threats might they bring to your country. And we see that especially from European countries, of course, from the United States, a changing dynamic, but especially in US-China relations. But we also see it in regions like Latin America, where this question of to some extent choice between countries that you work with, who's offering the better deal, but also who's offering the safer deal, I think is coming into play so much more for heads of government and for leaders of institutions.
That's a great point to make, something we are certainly seeing, and it bridges over, Jay, to this conversation around public diplomacy. To Matt's point, consumers are getting a lot more engaged even in not only paying attention to, but shaping geopolitical issues and what they expect in terms of how business is engaging and speaking out on certain issues. So as we see consumers start to do this and the public really start to take a greater role in geopolitical issues, Jay, first start by sharing, for those of us who don't know, what is public diplomacy? It's part of Diplo speak that we used to use at the State Department, but what is public diplomacy? And what are some of the public diplomacy practices that foreign ministries, that nation states are using, that businesses could use in order to navigate the geopolitical landscape?
Thanks, Michelle. Great to be on this panel with you and Matthew. First, a quick definition of public diplomacy and the context. So public diplomacy traditionally refers to a country's effort to inform and influence foreign publics through communication, including endeavors such as policy advocacy, cultural programming, exchange programs, language instruction, and media broadcasting. But public diplomacy is expanding as a practice that now requires the integration of diplomatic, social, and also corporate interests in order for us to advance international policy and action. It includes actions taken by non-state actors now. Non-state actors of growing consequence in a global system, such as multilateral organizations, NGOs, subnational actors like cities and states, and of course, corporations. As we know, the key is it comes down to what are these policy challenges that we face. So the core issues and policy challenges to be grappled with in our times certainly embody this very complex interdependence. Think climate change and think about digital technology and its consequences. Arguably, these two are the most significant developments of the 21st century. However, we don't have frameworks, we don't have structures that can adequately deal with these changes. And so in a way, the policy frameworks have not yet caught up to the speed of change as global policymaking and the public engagement are concerned. I think the crux of the matter here, and also what Michelle, you talked about, what your report shows, the crux of the matter here is a lack of clarity as regards to policy context for business operations and for communications. But we are seeing some changes. So on climate issues here in the United States, John Kerry is serving as the special envoy on climate. So there's a renewed effort to define what the climate policy is, what it means for international collaboration. And the Wall Street Journal just reported yesterday that the State Department is creating a new bureau of cyberspace that will comprise divisions of international cybersecurity, digital policy, and digital freedom. And I think these reflect ongoing efforts by the government to respond to these fundamental shifts in geopolitics and technological advancement. And I think that this transnational policy arena requires unprecedented international collaboration, also cross-sector collaboration. And of course, in practice, the real world connection between diplomacy or public diplomacy and the private sector has always been there. In this case, I believe this is an opportune time for us to rethink and reimagine the roles and linkages between the worlds of business and diplomacy and public diplomacy. And as the conversation carries on, we offer a couple of more preliminary thoughts about where the connections may lie and how the two worlds can work together in advancing international policy and actions for the benefits not only for the country but also for the companies.
That's really great, Jay. And actually, speaking of that, so as we're thinking about how public and private are coming together and where these intersections are happening, national security, Matt, that in our study came up as a very important factor to how executives are saying they do business across the world. And again, not something you hear businesses talk about on a daily basis, although you're seeing it in some places in terms of supply chain, as you talked about earlier, and how they're onshoring or diversifying at least where they're doing manufacturing and elements of their supply chain in order to make sure they're not too reliant upon any one country across the world. How are you seeing national security specifically make its way into conversations around how business and public and civil sectors are coming together to solve challenges? Are there new challenges now that they're talking about, new approaches? How does national security play into the discussion?
Well, Michelle, there's nothing like experiencing your true vulnerabilities as a moment to then all of a sudden realize that you have to start caring about specific things. And I think there's two ways to look at the national security piece. I think there's one that you could put in the national security bucket, you could put in a supply chain bucket, you could put in a few different spaces. And a perfect example to that would be chip manufacturing. People that are buying a Chevy Tahoe or buying a Corvette are waiting probably a year longer than they would have expected to get arrival of that car simply because there are not enough chips. Why? Because we have outsourced in the United States, and this is coming from a very US-centric position. We've outsourced manufacturing of chips to other countries all around the world. At last month's Concordia Summit, we heard from the CEO of Intel talking about their $5.5–6 billion investment in a new chip plant in Arizona. I think that was certainly sparked by the fact that all of a sudden we have a serious issue, which is experiencing our direct vulnerabilities in ways that we did not think would happen before. So I think that's an example where you could say, is that a manufacturing issue, a supply chain issue? Is that a national security issue? I think it's being put into the national security bucket a little bit. So it's important to keep that in mind. I think when I think about national security, I think about things around data theft. I think about identity issues. I think about more specifically data security, the kind of damage that can be done to an institution, either that is hacked or an institution where they are required by another country to house all of their data in that country. Can that be trusted? That's what really lies at the heart to me as a national security issue. Are government employees using phones that are manufactured by companies that are required to house certain amounts of data in another country? That is a national security issue. I think it's very much a US, European Union, China conversation more than anything else. I think what we're seeing in other parts of the world is they're still focused on what is the best opportunity and deal for my country and for the people of my country. And so I think where we're starting to see this be the most prevalent is in the European Union, the United States, and China in terms of a global conversation and around what companies are doing to address these issues. But the positive news is going back to this more informed consumer, people are now talking about it a lot more. And I think what we're going to see are some significant steps. I think Intel is just one of a number of examples of companies that are going to make adjustments to their supply chain, whether through the lens of purely manufacturing vulnerabilities and supply chain vulnerabilities or national security vulnerabilities.
Your point about data is a really good one, Matt, and that actually came up in our research as well. We asked executives open-ended questions. So if home country is really important and you believe acting in the national interest is a priority, well, how can a business deliver value to its home country? How can it act in the national interest? And either the second or the third of the top 6 factors that they pointed to was this idea of protecting data, protecting technology, protecting intellectual property, and this responsibility that they have to consumers, to employees, to their customers of protecting that data. So it was certainly very top of mind and parallels what we saw in our research. And turning over to you, Jay, another thing that executives highlighted is a way that they could contribute to their home country and their national interest was being a good brand ambassador across the world, to be a representative of the values and the fundamentals that make up home country values and home country interests, and use that to help the reputation of their home country across the world. How are you seeing that play out in your conversations around public diplomacy? What are some of the ways that businesses could think about being a brand ambassador for their home country as they're doing business across the globe?
Yeah, we clearly see, brands as this sort of a purveyor, of meaning and identity, and in this case, as a representation of a country. And especially for certain countries, the drivers of the national image may not be as diverse or varied as like a country like the United States. They may rely, a lot on what their companies are doing overseas. I do wanted to take a step back, also relating to this question with the earlier question, Michelle, you raised about national security. I do think there is a clear need for companies to think about building new organizational capabilities for global success. I don't think it's like, relying on current structure in terms of communicating our policies or engaging with our customers. And we need some new organizational capabilities. So, but what are those new organizational capabilities? And currently we don't have a very clear answer, but I do think that we need to answer 2 questions. One is identify what are the core skill sets and mindsets required to effectively pursue an international agenda for a company. And the second is to really take a closer look at the issues and attributes that are most likely to be addressed by leveraging and incorporating the diplomatic competencies, because companies are dealing with these policy issues, and they do have a vital role actually in shaping some of these policy discussions, right? And just one more point, I also think companies need to develop a more policy-sensitive, policy-informed engagement and communication, and that starts first internally, because many of these critical policies, as we were talking about, are evolving, are emerging, even with the geopolitical rivalry and the policies in this case, U.S.-China relations. Some still lack clear priorities, and others are potentially polarizing. So it calls for a broad-based internal appreciation and understanding of this kind of a layered, uncertain policy landscape, which requires internal mechanism for skills building and to infuse policy awareness in key functional areas, if not the entire workforce. And I do also believe that, and maybe an effective way to do this is to bring our business executives and diplomats together for upskilling and reskilling with a focus on tackling shared challenges. This will allow for a more enriched and nuanced understanding and also a practical grasp what sort of the mindsets are needed and the skill sets needed for addressing these policy-related communication engagement, both on both sides, for the companies, but also for our diplomats.
It's such a great point, Jay. And actually, so as we're thinking about this opportunity to bring public and private together, as businesses are being looked to solve challenges that governments previously had to do. National security was a role of a government, but now executives are saying they feel like that is their responsibility. I think we've got about a minute left, so I'm going to end on this final question that I'll ask both of you. We're talking about these new roles, these new challenges, this very fraught geopolitical landscape. And most of the time when we think about geopolitics, we think geopolitical risk. But where's the opportunity in all of this. Matt, from your perspective, in looking at public-private partnerships and solving global problems over the course of the past decade, where is the new opportunity today?
Ooh, challenging question, because there's so many things that we have yet to sort of see pan out at this time. For instance, I think that there is an enormous pendulum swing politically taking place in Latin America. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about opportunity in other parts of the world. I mean, when I think about where I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity, I think about the Indo-Pacific region. I think it's shifting that conversation a little bit so that it's not just solely focused on US-China relations, but instead what other opportunities exist in the region. And I think there's some significant ones. And then honestly, I think there is enormous opportunity in the United States. I feel very, very positive about where we are. Contrary to maybe how many people might think who watch the news every single day, but feel very optimistic from a business perspective. In terms of public and private sector cooperation, I think we're seeing it only increase, which is great. In most countries, it's a concept that is not often seen as the norm, and I think we're going to see it shift from being the exception more to the norm.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. And then Jay, final word, where do you see the opportunity today?
Yeah, it's just one thing. We talk about consumer identity, we talk about employee identity, and both are often situated these days in the intersecting locations that are transnational, national, but also subnational. So I do think that there is this ever more importance of seeking emotional truths that our brands embody, which transcend boundaries and the polemics of geographies and identities. And I think to do that, we may leverage some of the tools in the public diplomacy toolkit to help us to enhance this trust building and goodwill building between nations and peoples.
There you have it. Lots of opportunities still for businesses and other organizations navigating this geopolitical landscape. Matthew, Jay, thank you so much for the conversation here this morning. Appreciate the discussion.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you,
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Michelle. Some really smart advice on a tricky topic. And Michelle, can I just say, I love that you have a globe behind you. Seems very on brand.